Hello, everyone. My name is Tony Cooper, and I am the Data and Impact Manager at My Friend's Place, a drop-in center that serves youth experiencing homelessness. We are so excited to be hosting this panel, Young, Black, and Homeless, the devastating impacts of racism on homelessness. You may be wondering why we decided to talk about Black youth versus other youth who have also been oppressed. At MFP, we not only serve, but we dearly love every single youth that comes through our doors. We understand that all youth experiencing homelessness have been disenfranchised or oppressed. We are choosing to discuss Black youth for this panel because it is important that we elevate the conversation around structural systems of racism and oppression that have directly or indirectly impacted Black youth in our care. Statistically, Black people are 4 times as likely to experience homelessness. In LA County, Black people only make up 8% of the population, but make up 33% of the homeless population. Of youth experiencing homelessness, 40% identify as Black. And of the almost 1,400 youth at MFP that we serve annually, 46% identify as Black. Black people are disproportionately experiencing homelessness. And if we are to eradicate homelessness, we have to address structural racism and implicit bias. One thing that I want to note before we begin is that when we talk about Black youth, please note that the Black youth experience is not monolithic. It is expansive, it's beautiful, and it's diverse. At MFP, we acknowledge and honor that the identities of the youth we serve are intersectional and impacts how they experience the world. Through research, personal anecdotes, and clinical expertise, we are hoping to speak to and honor the diverse experiences of the Black community. So, with no further ado, I would like for the panelists to go ahead and introduce themselves by stating their names, their pronouns, and how they are connected to MFP. We will start off with Dr. China Hill, followed by our alum, Shiahan, and last but certainly not least, our Director of Programs, Erin Casey.
Hi, everyone. Good evening. Thank you for joining us. My name is Dr. China Hill. I'm a researcher at the University of Southern California. I've been doing research at MFP for about 1.5 years now, and I've really connected with the youth there.
Hi, my name is Shiahan, and I am an alumni at MFP. My pronouns are he, him, they, theirs. And yeah.
Yeah, good evening, everyone. My name is Erin Casey, pronouns she, her, hers. And I have been with My Friend's Place for going on 17 years and currently serving as the Director of Programs.
We are so excited for this panel, so we are going to get straight into it. We're going to start off with Miss Dr. China Hill. So I have a great question for you. Based off of the statistics, we see that there is an overrepresentation of Black youth in homelessness. And I was hoping that you could speak to that. What systems or factors contributed to this?
Yeah, absolutely. So Black youth currently comprise about 1/3 of the homeless youth population, so about 33%. Research suggests that this is because of their disproportionate representation in other systems, so the juvenile justice system and or foster care. Youth who have been involved in these systems often have had their education trajectories disrupted, they've had family bonds disrupted, and they've been deterred because of negative experiences from using other service systems in the future.
Thank you. Thank you so much for that, China. That is a broad perspective, and we really appreciate that. Shiahan, you have lived experience with homelessness, not only in California, but out of state as well. Can you share an experience that highlights your engagement with the social services as a biracially identified person?
So originally I do come from Minnesota, which is historically very high on its treatment of homelessness and homeless youth. They have a lot of services, but normally in Minnesota, you have to go out and actively seek out those services. But moving here to California, it was a bit of a culture shock because going out to seek out those services came out to seek you. And I thought that was very helpful, but I had a pretty mixed experience between services. Like I've had some services that were very heavily orientated toward their non-POC clients, where they did everything and everything happened for them within a 3 to 6 month period, while their POC clients ended up waiting 1-2 years and got zero progress whatsoever. And then on the other hand, there were other services that got everything done within the 6 months to a year. And the reason why they were slower was because they were making sure that they did it right the first time, instead of having to revoke services or go back on their word or promise something that they couldn't actually do. And that being said, I've also had a pretty mixed experience with youth services as well. Like there are services like from MFP, where you guys were very helpful and very quick on the draw and could almost predict the services that the youth needed. Whereas other places kind of didn't do much of anything at all. And their excuse was that because the youth weren't doing anything to help themselves, they weren't going to do anything to help the youth.
Thank you for that, Shiahan. That is, I'm still muted. Sorry about that. Happens all the time on Zoom. But thank you for that perspective. That was really helpful. And I think it gives some insight into what we're going to start talking about now. So China, can you give us a little background on your research and how it elevates the conversation around the overrepresentation of Black youth in the homeless sector?
Yeah, absolutely. So my work does a lot around service use. If Black youth are using services, what services are they using? And if they're not, why? So in a recent paper, I found that Black youth have a relatively low rate of services, especially as it relates to healthcare and mental health services. But when you look at basic needs, such as drop-in centers, we do see Black youth using those at high rates. Shelter use as well, they compare with that of other youth. One of the reasons that Black youth often don't use services such as mental health or healthcare services is because of negative experiences associated with those systems, and also the stigma in the Black community around mental health services. There's also other things that come into play, such as access, location of services, and cost. Even youth who have been involved in the foster care system or youth who have been involved in juvenile justice systems, they still don't know how to access those services once they become homeless. And then, in addition to all of those barriers, being a foster care youth, being in the juvenile justice system, and being Black, those are often associated with negative experiences, such as longer wait times, bias from staff, or just not getting the respect you deserve when you try and access those services. So in the future, Black youth, in some cases, would rather be homeless than access their service system.
Wow. You said longer wait times for housing, correct?
Yes.
So could you delve into that whole experience, housing navigation from beginning to end? A youth accesses drop-in center services. What would it look like for someone who is trying to access housing?
Yeah, absolutely. So when a youth comes into a center and says that I'm homeless, they're often administered the Next Step tool for youth. The Next Step tool is an assessment. It consists of about 28 questions. Youth answer those questions. It assesses risk and vulnerability. So it'll ask you like name, date of birth, race, reasons you became homeless, if you've ever been arrested. It'll assess mental and physical health briefly. Based on the answers to those questions, youth receive a score. So youth who score between 0 and 3 aren't typically eligible for housing services. If they score 4 to 7, they're eligible for rapid rehousing, and anything 7 or higher, they're available for permanent supportive housing. The problem with this is, although youth may be getting rapid rehousing vouchers, the wait time to get a voucher could be anywhere from 6 months to a year. And then even once they have a voucher, trying to find housing is often very difficult. So youth rapid rehousing is a really time limited intervention. So youth might get part of their rent paid for a while, and then they have to take over those payments by themselves. In Los Angeles, market rate rental costs are absolutely absurd. So for youth to take on those costs is often very difficult, and the rapid rehousing isn't a sufficient intervention for those youth. In addition, the rapid rehousing that is available is often located in areas that don't have transportation, or transportation is limited. Youth can't get into work, youth can't get into the city, or these rapid rehousing programs are located in areas deemed unsafe. They can't access their resources. They can't access family and friends.
Wow. And based off of your research, have you seen any discrepancies in how the Next Steps tool assess vulnerability for Black youth?
So one of the things about the Next Step tool is that it hasn't been empirically validated. Right now, with one of the projects I'm working on, we're looking at the questions that are actually predictive of certain vulnerabilities and certain outcomes for Black youth, Latino youth, white youth, all youth, and which ones are necessary and which ones aren't. In terms of outcomes, we do know that Black youth who exit to family often return back to homelessness at higher rates than their peers. And then we also know in that same line that youth of color are less likely to return to family than other youth. So white youth, Latino youth, and other youth of color.
Wow. Shiahan, can you speak to this experience? What is your current housing status and where are you in this process that China has just described?
So as far as my experience has been, it took me 5 years from the start of it to the finish. So 5 years ago, I moved to LA, and the first thing that I did was I went to the LA Lgbt Center because they were the first place that popped up on Google. But while I was there for a little over a year, and I received very little to no help whatsoever. The staff were more heavily focused on their more openly gay clients and their more non-POC clients, which I felt was very unfair. So then one of the other staff who happened to be POC and happened to be a youth who had just been hired by the center actually mentioned MFP. And so I did go to MFP. And I was there for maybe 6 months, and I had been hooked up with 3 separate programs. But my problem was that those programs, after 2 years, 2.5 years, didn't do much of anything to help because once again, they were more heavily focused on their non-POC youth. And then around the 4th year, Step Up contacted MFP and asked for a list of youth that would fit their criteria. And my name ended up on that list. And I finally got hooked up with a program that not only helped me, but went out of their way to offer me services that I didn't even know existed at the time. So it's been about 5 years, and I am now in an apartment under a subsection of the rapid rehousing, which means for the next 18 months, Step Up is helping me pay my rent. And then after that, hopefully by then my Section 8 and my SSI have kicked in, which Step Up has also helped, and MFP have both helped me get in contact. So hopefully after those 18 months, I can still handle paying my own rent. But it did take a very long time. It took almost a year, and that was only because Step Up wanted to make sure that they did everything properly the first time, which not a lot of programs do. A lot of programs like to rush through things to try to get their youth help as soon as possible. And sometimes this could mean making promises that they can't keep, which can be very frustrating because they'll go, oh yeah, we can get you housed within 3 months. And then 6 months later, you're still not housed and you're wondering what's going on, and you get really frustrated and eventually leave the program, or you age out of the program before they can help you. They're trying to do everything correctly, but they're just taking too long to do it. Thankfully, I was one of the lucky ones where I did age out, but I aged out of most of the programs on good terms with the staff and the programs. So I was still able to access some of the services that I still vitally needed, such as food, clothing, and on occasion, showers. And
Thank you, Shiahan. That makes a lot of sense. Aaron, I'm curious, based off of Shiahan's experience and based off of yours, what are some barriers you've confronted as you've tried to assist youth as they navigate the CES system, particularly Black youth?
Yeah, so I think, you know, China's remarks already really centered this, but it just seems kind of worth repeating that that housing security is absolutely a matter of equity and justice, and that has to be our starting off point, and that including in how we address the housing needs of people who are currently unhoused. Because of structural racism, communities of color and people of color are more at risk for becoming homeless. So I think, and then like on top of that, right, because racism is so insidious and so pervasive, that even the systems that are meant to help and create more equity oftentimes repeat and replicate racism and racist practices just in a different way. So I think again, Dr. China Hill already, Dr. China Hill, wow. Dr. China already said this, but it's worth repeating because of how we really see it play out for individual young people, that the permanent or housing, including rapid rehousing, that is often available is most often in poor minority communities that don't receive a lot of community investment. And I think beyond that, this is, you know, like young people will talk about it being in a neighborhood where they don't feel safe, either because of their own trauma history or because of community and police violence. And we hear so often, particularly for our young Black men, that they're not sleeping in the apartments that they were matched to because they don't feel safe. So arguably, we're not solving one's homelessness at all if we're not housing folks in communities where they feel safe and they feel like they can thrive. I think with that, the other dynamic, this mindset sometimes comes into play in which, I don't know a better way to say this, but a little bit of like a beggars can't be choosers mindset. And we have this expectation that young people take housing, they accept whatever housing is offered to them. And I think like on a gut level, we all just know that that's wrong, but I think it's pretty important to kind of name exactly why that's wrong. So I think that mindset in and of itself is a function of oppression. And I think really our kind of the dislike, the NIMBYism, the dislike that we have for poor people in general, and oftentimes in how wealth equity plays out in this country is that people who are of lower socioeconomic status are oftentimes people of color, and particularly Black people. So I know, or I'm told, that in other countries, when they look to kind of think about community investment and affordable housing, they are asking themselves the question, where would you want your mother to live? That's not how we're approaching it in this city or in this country. I think we are, so when young people, I think, you know, say when they turn down housing opportunities, that is seen as a young person showing up as entitled versus empowered. So that's something else we have to name. Like we are wanting our young people to feel empowered to take control of their lives so that they have access to the resources that they need to thrive and achieve self-sufficiency. And this idea that they should just accept whatever housing that is offered to them is wrong. And I think this is obvious, but sometimes we have to state the obvious, right? That just reeks of privilege. All of us care about where we live. A lot of us, you know, we turn down jobs because it's not the, you know, exactly the right fit, but we do something, you know, with our youth who are experiencing homelessness, where we sometimes have this expectation that they should just be happy with whatever job is offered, whatever housing is offered to them. Yeah, so I think those are some of the more structural issues. And then I think that there are definitely a lot of work to be done in terms of acknowledging when young people are asked to exit some of the housing placements. And I think the system could really be helped if there was some coordinated oversight of what should lead to an exit. I think that's a really important issue. And I know at my friend's place, even being in for our social work team, the level, the sphere of influence and advocacy that we have to help a young person keep their housing, it's not very deep. So that I think is another structural issue. Yeah.
Thank you, Erin. That was That was profound, and we really appreciate you being able to really kind of dig into your experience and really highlighting and acknowledging, the struggles that Black youth are facing, and youth in general are facing, who are experiencing homelessness as they try to navigate the CES system and receive housing. So moving on to Dr. China. We are so impressed with your research, and I was hoping that you could go ahead and dig into more of your research that looks at perceived bias and how it impacts service utilization among Black youth.
Yeah, sure. So, in my work at MFP and in looking at some of the survey results, we found that there was a disconnect between the youth being surveyed at MFP and the staff who actually look like them. And this was something that was really important for Black youth, is to see representation in the staff for people who look like them, who could relate to their backgrounds culturally or relate just to the Black experience, especially coming from a summer of just absolute social unrest. It was really important for Black youth to see that representation. And then also going back to the Next Step tool for youth, we've heard over and over again that the questions are way too sensitive. And I think that's another barrier to services. And we need to consider, what do we absolutely need to know? And then what can we do to house Black youth without causing trauma, without re-triggering them? Are all of these questions absolutely necessary to place Black youth into housing and then the appropriate housing resource? And then a lot of times we see that there's just a lack of culturally relevant programming, whether that's at drop-in centers, whether that's at shelters. It's just not a lot of relevant programming for Black youth that necessarily meets their needs. So as an example, with Black youth, they might not define themselves as literal homelessness, right? But they might be couch surfing with friends, with family for an extended period of time. And we need programming that really takes that into account. Um, and in the search for rapid rehousing, there's also a lot that we don't talk about when it comes to bias from landlords, who they accept a housing voucher from, the credit checks that happen sometimes, the background checks that happen sometimes, and then just the inability of Black youth to sustain these market rental prices once a program has said, you exceeded your 18 months and now you need to try and work to pay your rent on your own. So that as well. And then in some cases, you do have folks who consider eviction histories or utility shuts off. And those things aren't really considered when you give a Black youth a voucher and say, hey, go find housing. And those things are critical because they speak to like a history of injustice and social inequities.
Wow, that's really important research, China. I'm curious, did you collect this data at MFP only, or did you collect this data at other agencies as well?
So this particular survey was only conducted at MFP. But in this survey, we did ask about other youth centers in the area. So we asked about their experience at the LGBT Youth Center and also at SPY.
And did you see that the experience overall was pretty similar, depending on which agency they went to, or did you see that there were some discrepancies depending on which agency that the youth was visiting and accessing services from?
Yeah, so with MFP and the LGBT Center, it seemed that youth of color overall, Black youth, Latino youth, and other youth really felt welcomed. They felt like they had a place here. Where at youth centers like SPY, they saw even less staff who looked like them. And then SPY was also far from where they were residing, whereas MFP and the LGBT Center was kind of center. So you could get there from South LA, you can get there from the other side of town, the Valley, if you needed to. And youth tend to use services at MFP more often. And then there was also an interesting thing that came up about the hours of MFP. The hours were more convenient for youth who were working and they could access them when they needed to. And yeah, that was helpful for them.
Thank you for that. That's really interesting. So I think when people do research, it's kind of hard to be able to delineate between which agencies that they collected their data from. So it is interesting to be able to see if there was a discrepancy or a difference, depending on which agency the youth were accessing their services from. And speaking of bias and perceived bias and service utilization, at MFP, we really thought it was important to understand youth experience. We thought it was really important to understand how staff responses to youth, depending on a certain situation, could possibly limit their ability to access services. And so we conducted some internal research back in 2018, and this research was looking at how staff respond to youth based off of their gender or ethnicity, if they've had a behavioral issue in our space. And when conducting that research, we did see that we tended to give harsh responses to Black youth, to youth who identify as male, and to also our trans female youth. And so based off of this research, we had to take a good look at ourselves. And not only take a good look at ourselves, but at our programming, at our structures. We had to make some changes. And so I was hoping that Erin Casey would be willing to talk about some of those changes that we've implemented and how we've decided to move forward.
Yeah, so I think, I think like Tony said, I think the internal research really just called us in to really take a look at, you guys, I'm so sorry. I have a dog here who has a lot to say on the subject matter. Can you hear him? You can. Okay. Tony, give me 1 second. Can you keep talking about our research and let me see if I can handle this? I'm so sorry.
Absolutely, no worries. So one of the things that we've done, I'll begin while Erin is working with her little pup. So one of the things that we did was we actually began a JEDI committee. And so on this JEDI committee, we thought it was important that all levels of the agency were represented. So we have directors, we have managers, we have program staff, and then we also have alum. And Shiahan is actually on our JEDI committee and has been able to give some really, really great input. And with that input has allowed us to be able to make some informed decisions about our programming, about different events that we're hosting, et cetera. And so that's one thing that we've done. We are also in the process of rerunning this research. One of the things that we did was we updated our system. We updated our system so that we could really understand the trajectory of an incident from beginning to end. So we could see how staff responded, then how youth responded back to us, and then how we responded in that next regard, whether we called the police or security or asked the youth to leave. And so we're in the process of rerunning that. So stay tuned. We might be presenting that research somewhere very soon. So Erin, I think Erin is back with us.
Yeah, hopefully. Lucky apologizes to the audience and to the panelists. Yeah, so I think, so Tony, tell me if I'm repeating anything that you might have already said, but I think, the biggest thing was that just this consciousness, this attention to collective consciousness around that we were replicating what we knew to be national trends and our like fierce commitment to do better, right? That very kind of idea, I think, as we really take a look at racial justice issues, like when you know better, you do better. And My Friend's Place really took that on. So the consciousness raising around it, I think also it was confronting the idea that we also seem to be operating from a place of bias, named particularly the adultification bias, which is this idea that particularly for young Black men, we tend to see them as more threatening, more threatening, less innocent, sometimes more capable, which I think one can think about that as a strength, but I think how it really plays out, not as a strength, is that the capability, we then have a harder time acknowledging the trauma behavior and not seeing it as trauma behavior, but seeing it as kind of, more, problematic behavior. So it was really just kind of challenging ourselves in everyday conversations when that came up, to check ourselves on that bias. And then as Tony said, mostly driven by Tony as our data and impact manager, making sure that we were creating systems that at least as we were making decisions, because that's, this is how the power differential shows up. Like young people are coming to us in need of basic services, right? These are life-sustaining daily services, and the power that we have around, both granting access and also limiting access. I think we just all the more really took that super seriously, and we became more, collectively conscious for sure. And we're looking forward. We're not naive about it. Like, we're looking forward to see what the research shows, to see if this has had, you know, impact in the right direction. And if it hasn't, we're going to keep taking it on.
Thank you, Erin. Another question for, let's say another agency became aware of bias that they were perpetrating. What would you suggest to their directors or their leadership in ways that they could, you know, work to improve? What are some actionable steps that they could take, not only for the directorship, but also for program staff at their agency to try to alleviate this issue?
Sorry, Tony, I'm sorry. Was that directed to me or to Tina? To me?
That was to you.
Yeah. Yeah, I mean, I think the biggest thing I would say to organizational leadership, I think as organizations kind of make bolder statements about commitments to anti-racism work, it has to involve, you know, both the willingness to look internally, as well as to kind of identify the external issues that are contributing to how racism gets perpetuated in homeless youth spaces. So I think one, it would be just to continue to be bold and to take it on, and to consider. I mean, I think, you know, with our internal research, it was very clear to us just that this, you know, this was about my friend's place. So I'm not trying to minimize that at all. But we also knew that if it was happening at my friend's place, it was happening in the collective, and what could be the collective impact to be had. And there's actually efforts being made at the HIP, which is the Hollywood Homeless Youth Partnership, of which my friend's place is a member, to take a look at this with all of the other organizations. I think one of the other actionable items as well is just to continue to, I think the next kind of evolution of trauma-informed care, of which my friend's place has been a leader in Los Angeles for the last 15 years, is really to look at trauma-informed care through a race justice lens. So if we go ahead and name the everyday racism that our youth of color are experiencing just by being Black youth living in the world, let alone living unhoused in the world, the amount of emotional and traumatic stress and injury that they're carrying around is huge. And what happens? Like, where do you put that when you are someone carrying that load of traumatic stress? Sometimes that results in unpredictable behavior. And I think all of us in this homeless youth space have a lot of work to do to continue to think about, I don't think we have cracked that nut. Like, how are we responding to the kind of unpredictable behavior that results from race-based trauma, and making sure that we're, you know, keeping safe, but also staying attached and continuing to give young people opportunities to heal and not re-traumatize.
Thank you for that, Erin. That was very helpful. Shiahan, so as we mentioned a little bit earlier while Erin was working with her pup, you are on the Jedi committee at MFP. So based on your involvement, what are you excited about? And what do you think could positively impact new youth entering into homelessness for the first time and seeking services at MFP?
And I'm actually excited that MFP took up the torch and established the Jedi Committee. I think it's very beneficial, and I think more youth services need to establish. But on the subject of MFP, I'm excited about new programs that we've discussed, and will be started basically and put into place to make sure that all of the youth, both POC and non-POC youth, have an equal opportunity to receive all of the services across the board, instead of just the services that the staff think at the time they're eligible for, as well as programming that's already in place that has been relooked at and rewritten so that it's a little more open about the eligibility status for some of the youth, because there are some youth that, well, there's a thing among POC communities where you can be passing and not passing. What this means is that you can be multiracial or more of one race than another and look entirely like you're non-POC. And in some youth programs, this affects your eligibility status for some programs. I think it's really important to mention that MFP is taking a secondary look at some of this and is implementing new ways to establish their eligibility status among their youth. I also think it's important to mention that MFP not only recognizes that there is systemic racism, but is acknowledging the fact that while it may not always be obvious, sometimes it does come into play with some of the staff and some of the youth at MFP, and they are not only looking at these situations in a different light, they're also doing more about making sure that sorry, I apologize, that this systematic racism doesn't come into play when it comes to youth access services. They're also having conversations with other programs and other social service programs to make sure that youth experiencing homeless don't also experience racism at the same time. Because when I first moved to LA, I did not have any problems with the legal system. I had only been arrested once in my life, and I'd never had a record. But then when I moved to LA, I developed a criminal record simply for being Black and homeless at the same time. And the amount of racism that I experienced was through the roof. I'm happy to say that over the years, it's settled down due to services like MFP and other youth services having direct contact with police and other organizations to make sure that racism is not an active participant in the way that they handle homeless youth. Other than that, I will say that MFP is working hard to make sure that all services are always acceptable and always accessible to all of their youth. But there are certain services that are specifically for POC youth that are coming into play that I think are really important. And I can't wait for all of these programs to be enacted and to start for everybody.
Thank you, Shiahan. We really appreciate that. China, to wrap up this panel, can you share a couple of ways that those watching, whether they're viewers, service providers, researchers, or administrators, can harness your research or anything discussed in this panel to ameliorate the racial disparities that we have discussed today?
Yeah, absolutely. So I think it's really important to just do the work and to do the research. It's not the job of Black youth or Black researchers to teach you to be less racist. So much of that work has to start with you. I think also sitting with your privilege, acknowledging that you didn't just make good choices, you had good choices. Everyone didn't start at that level set. I think that's really important. And to spend more time listening, we need to talk to Black youth. We need to ask what they need. We need to ask how we can be better advocates instead of assuming that we know what they need. From the provider perspective, hire more Black people and not like the frontline workers, hire more Black people in your leadership too, because that's important. Have more Black people in positions of power, have more Black people making some decisions, especially as it relates to Black youth. Employ more culturally appropriate and sensitive programming to the needs of Black youth. That's important. And then incorporating more clinical staff and clinical approaches, trauma-informed approaches to information gathering. I think we could also spend more time evaluating what we really need to know versus what actually doesn't matter that much, and consider how invasive some questions, some things are. And then just overall, I can't emphasize this enough, but involving Black youth in the process, not in the middle of the process, not at the end of the process, at the very beginning of the process, involving Black youth and involving them in positions of power. Don't just say, hey, come join this board, we've already started. Ask them, do you want to help me put together a board? Don't involve them in the end or in the middle. Start up front and bring them in at the beginning of the conversation. I think that's so important.
Thank you, China. That, right, snaps to that. More Black youth, yes. So Shiahan and Aaron, I just want you to share one thing that you would want the viewers to take away from this panel. We'll start with Shiahan and we will end with Aaron.
I think it's important for the viewers to take most of the information from this panel. It was really great in mentioning how youth need to be more empowered when it comes to programming involving the youth. Instead of just being seen as youth, the youth need to be seen as an important player. Like if you're looking at it like a chessboard, the youth would be the queen. Everybody else would be assisting them getting their life together and getting off the streets, getting jobs, and housing appropriately. However, most programs view the youth as a pawn, as just a number, somebody that they only need to consult at the very end of the process. Like China said, they need to be involved throughout the entire process. Ask them what programs they need. Ask them how the programs can better fit them. Ask the youth for their opinion. Don't just view them as a number, view them as a person.
Yeah, I think all that China said and all that Shiahan said, and I guess just what I would add is I think I don't know, like even for myself, like being a panelist, like some of the takeaways, right, are just that there is so we can't stop like this matter of housing justice for Black communities, for the Black youth that we love and serve. It just needs all of our attention and all of our effort all of the time, and we just can't stop. We can't stop when it gets hard. We can't stop when we see that, you know, there's something that we're not doing right. That's actually when we need to do the exact opposite. We need to like really dig in and dig deep. And I think just that continued analysis. I think I'm also just thinking how, you know, it takes like the failure is in the village and also the solution is in the village, right? So we need researchers. We need, obviously, the biggest constituency, our youth doing this. We need the staff. To China's point, we absolutely need to diversify the staff doing this work. We need the supporters. This is just about all of us. It needs all of us.
This has been such a great panel, such a great conversation. I've left this feeling so enriched. And I think, you know, there's no better way to end it other than saying we can't stop. We won't stop. We will continue this. You know, I'm not going to wrap, but we cannot stop. We will not stop. And we will continue on this journey until we eradicate homelessness, until we combat racism. So thank you so much for joining this panel, and have a great evening.